So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Ken Burak from Northampton Community College. He's also a visiting faculty member at Lehigh. And you can read his bio on our website or on our meetup page. I didn't bring a printout with me, but I did check out his ratings on ratemyprofessor.com, and there's multiple people who say he's an awesome dude. So I think that's the way I'm going to introduce this awesome dude today. And I have a video queued up. Did you want to play it first? Do you want to just ready?
No, can I say like, and action?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have the remote.
My line, and action.
Okay, it'll be ready to go. I'll actually turn the TV off for a little bit if there's going to be some lead time, and then just let me know. All right, so please welcome Professor Ken Burak.
Okay. Do you think I could get away with not using this?
No.
No? And that's it. Okay, I'm going to talk into this then. All right. I might forget every once in a while, and then just you can go like. Okay. Hi, my name is Ken Burak. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Kate invited me. Kate Wilberger. She was a student of mine. I'm a philosophy professor at Northampton Community College. First, I just want to say something about one of the reasons why this is so exciting to me. I mean, I'm excited to speak to you or with you and have a discussion with you guys about this topic, specifically given your mission statement. But just in general, the concept of a public event where people come together and just take some time to have an event like this, I think is really amazing. And if I have like one lament about my profession, it's that, and this will be, we'll talk about this when we talk about the movie, but it's that I teach in a context, the context in which I facilitate having people come together and have discussions about philosophical issues. But I do so in a context where people are primarily coming because they want to get a job, and somebody told them in order to get a job, you need to get a degree. In order to get a degree, you need to take some classes, and you need to take this class. So like they're coming into the room with this energy of this bribe that's there. Like, if you come talk about these issues, I'll give you a pass to go forward in your dreams. And if you don't listen, then I won't let you go forward for your dreams. And I'm sort of like holding their future hostage. That's the way I see it. In fact, when I make a syllabus, sometimes I make the syllabus all in ransom letters. Which, I always kind of imagine that never actually happened, that somebody really like took the time to cut out all of the letters, like to preserve their anonymity, because they could have just typed it. In any case, I'll do it in ransom letters to say like, so this, and we'll talk about it. It's like, why do they do it? It's like, I feel like we're in this context. If I came into my kid's room in the middle of the night to check in on her, and then she wasn't there, and there was a ransom letter in the place. And the ransom letter said, if you ever want to see your child again, then give me $1 million. I feel often that that's what's going on in so many aspects of our society. There's this sort of like, people's future is being held hostage, and I feel like the syllabus is this way of saying, listen, if you want your future, this is if you ever want to see your future, this is what you need to do. And so they're coming for that reason. And I try my best to get us to a point where people are coming because they actually really enjoy thinking about these things and talking about these things, but it's a struggle. And so my point is, it's really exciting to me to see people coming together on a Sunday, and this idea that we're all going to get together, we're coming from different backgrounds, we had different life experiences, and we certainly had different mornings, but one thing we all have in common is we all spent the last hour talking about this one topic, and now we can discuss it. I just think it's a really amazing thing that happens in society, and I'm really honored to be part of it. Okay, so Monsters, Inc. I think philosophically what I have to say today, the sort of argument that I have to make, I'm not going to focus on the argument that I'm making because it's clear that you're making this argument. The basic argument that I'm trying to convey with the analysis of the movie is Basically, I mean, you can put it in terms of good without God, but the way I put it is good without fear. So this basic idea that we're kind of afraid to see what would happen in society if you took fear out of the equation. That we don't need to actually be afraid of people. That you don't need to scare them to get them to be good, to get them to do all kinds of things. They could do what they're doing. They could do what they need to do. They could do the things that a society needs people to do, not because by scaring them, by telling them, do it or else something terrible will happen to you. You'll burn in hell, you'll go to a prison. You know, I try not to teach my students in a way where I say, like, learn or I'll do something bad to you. But you get that idea. I think what might be interesting to you is to think about that. You might not have associated that idea with Monsters, Inc. in particular. So here's what I'm thinking about Monsters, Inc. First of all, can I see a show of hands of people who have seen the Pixar movie Monsters, Inc.? Okay. How about a show of hands of people who haven't seen it? Okay, cool. All right, well, I'll give like a quick rundown of the movie. Wait, hold on. For the people who have seen it, raise your hand if you thought about that movie, you thought like, oh, well, that's some deep philosophy right there. Nobody? Awesome. Okay. All right, well, you might want to, my goal here will be to maybe like inspire you to think about that movie philosophically. And maybe to be able to use it when you're having the kinds of discussions that you have with people about the mission of an organization like this. So, basic rundown. 1, monsters are real. They really exist in this Pixar movie. 2, they really do lurk behind the door of human children's closets. Raise your hand if you were worried about a monster in your closet when you were a kid. Totally, yeah. I actually, was found by my dad trying to unscrew the hinges of the closet door because it was just too stressful if I could just see straight into the closet. Anyway, so it turns out there's this other dimension where there's monsters that exist. And in this other society, there's this city called Monstropolis. And it has the trappings of our civilization. It has factories and roads and traffic signals and apartments and couches. People go to work. And the way this city works is, the way Monstropolis works is it's fueled by human fear. That's what the city runs on. And so there's this factory called Monsters, Inc. And at Monsters, Inc., they produce, I'm not sure which is the right metaphor, I think maybe produce children's fear. And the way human children's fear, the way they do that is they punch in and say like, hey, Jim, how's it going? And then they go to work and they go to the assembly line, and coming down the assembly line are these doors to human children's closets. And they open a door, go into the human's world, specifically into the kind of mind of the children's bedroom, scare the living daylights out of the child. The child, you'll see it. The child screams, and they capture the screams, the fear of the child, and they bring it back through the door, back to their civilization, and kind of like burning coal, they make their civilization run. So, that's the basic setup. And that's how the society works. And they just do it.
She says, why would any parent take their child to that movie? Well, I watched that with my little nephews years ago when it first came out, and they loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not scary. It's
Well,
not scary.
well, here's another answer. Because you want them to grow up to be good atheists. There's that one. But then there's also this one. I'll try to make the case. Okay, here's what happens, though. So that's the setup. And what happens is and the monsters, so the humans are afraid of the monsters, but the monsters are all very afraid of the humans. And that's really important, actually, for my analysis. Whenever, like, a human sock gets through, the monsters totally freak out. It's also totally propaganda, you find out at the end of the movie. The, like, sort of in power, authority, government monsters have convinced everybody to be afraid of the humans But actually, there's no reason to be afraid of the humans. That's really important. We'll come back to that. Okay, so a human child named Boo gets through to the monster world. And somehow or other befriends the two main characters, the two monsters, Mike Wazowski, and Sully. Sully's big and blue. Wazowski is small and green. It's very important. I don't know if that's important. And so they like Boo, and they become friends, and they try to hide Boo. And they become really good friends, and then they can't find Boo, and they're totally freaking out. And there's a problem. There's these new, like, millennial monsters, recruits, who aren't really scary and aren't working very hard. And the boss guy, Water Noose, kind of looks like a spider, is trying to get the new recruits to learn how to scare well. They go into rooms and they're just sort of like, boo, and the kids don't scream, and so they don't get much fear, and so they can't run the society. They're trying to make them better workers. And they invite veteran Sully in to give a little scare demonstration. And Sully's busy looking for Boo, and he's just like, I can't do it, Mr. Water Noose. That's the scene we're going to watch. Mr. Water Noose, there's no time, there's no time, there's no time. And Mr. Water Noose keeps insisting. He's saying, come on, roar, roar, show these recruits. And there's this sort of like fake bedroom where there's like a mechanical human child, and you're supposed to try to scare the child so that it screams, and all the recruits can't do it. And so the boss wants Sully to demonstrate how to do this. So finally Sully gives in. He says, fine, Mr. Waters, there's no time. Fine, I'll do it. And what Sully doesn't realize is that Boo is actually hiding kind of near the bed. So here's Sully at the foot of the bed about to scare the mechanical child. You following this? Yes. And what he doesn't realize is that Boo is like right there. And Boo's going to be looking up. So I'm going to show you this scene, but I just want to say for a moment that philosophy, Western philosophy at least, has as its core fundamental imperative, know thyself. Somehow or other, have an experience in which you are knowing something, and what you're knowing is you. You're not knowing daisies, you're not knowing the clouds, you're not knowing your friend, you're knowing yourself. And there are many moments in the history of cinema where cinematically they create the instance when somebody knows themselves. They see themselves in a stark way. I teach a philosophy of film class at Lehigh, and we look at the history of films that have these moments where somebody sees themselves. They recognize something about themselves that they were blind to. I don't think in the history of cinema there is anywhere nearly as cool or amazing a cinematic take on self-discovery, of seeing yourself, than in this scene of Monsters, Inc. How's that for a setup? Okay, action.
Give us a big loud roar. Mr. Water Noose, there's no time for this. Come on, what are you waiting for? Roar! But sir, roar! Well done. Ooh. All right, gentlemen. I hope you learned a valuable lesson this year. Ooh. Oh, it's me. The child.
Sir, she isn't possible. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me.
No, it's okay. I was just... No, don't be scared. That wasn't real. It's just a... I was just...
Here it is.
He was gonna test it out on that sweet little girl.
that's it. Great, right? It's pretty powerful, I think. So yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I distinguish between, I like to distinguish between who you are and who you're being. You know, like when you say to somebody, you know, you're being a real jerk right now. And the person might say, like, you're calling me a jerk? He says, no, I'm not saying you're a jerk. I'm saying you're being a jerk right now. That's, for me, really important. I think often who we are is not who we're being. And I mean, the whole idea of know thyself is kind of a weird command because it's like, how can I not know myself? I mean, I'm right here. If it's the case that we don't know ourselves, then it must be the case, but we're still living our lives on the basis of an assumption of who we are, then who we are, the idea must be that who we are isn't who we think we are. And so who we're being in our lives is not necessarily who we are. And the idea of know thyself is find out who you actually are, not who you think you are. In this moment, I feel like for Sully, he's, what he realizes is like, I think what he might say at that moment would be, wow, I'm a monster. Now, I would say you're not a monster, you're being a monster. But, you know, he has this moment where he's really confused. He had this tight relationship with somebody, and now suddenly she's afraid of him, and he doesn't understand why. And he's looking at her, and he can't understand why she's looking at him the way that she is. Why are you backing up? Come on, we're friends, it's me. And she's totally freaked out. And he starts to see, and he's sort of like, well, I mean, you do know that was all just sort of like, you know, that was just a job. Like, that was no big thing. That's not really me. I mean, it's just something I do. And then he sees the video camera. And so if he was here at the foot of the bed, and then Boo is down here, the video camera is coming from back here. And so he's seeing himself the way that Boo saw him, which was totally scary. And I imagine him sort of like looking, he's like, I don't understand. And then he sees it. Oh, he sees himself reflected back at himself. Oh, that's what I do. Like, I scare children for a living. That's what I do. And I have to believe that every teacher at a certain point, especially teachers of young kids, have had a moment when they realize they have a good relationship with the kid, and then the kid fails a test, you know? And I don't think there's like a moment when teachers explain to kids, look, here's the deal. You as a species decided to go down a path where you don't know how to feed or clothe or house yourself. That's your deal. You're completely dependent on money. You'll die without buying those things. You don't know how to get your own food. You don't know how to get your own water. Here's the deal. You're on life support. And if you don't get money, you won't get food, which means you'll die. If you don't get, somebody's like, okay, well, how do I get money? Well, you need to get a job. Okay, well, give me a job. No. First of all, you need to get a degree. Well, okay, give me a degree. And it's like, no, first of all, you need to like go to school and do all this stuff. And so the teachers are saying to people, in effect, if you don't read this book, if you don't do this thing, if you don't do well in school, you're not going to get a degree. And if you don't get a degree, you're not going to get a job. And if you don't get a job, you're not going to get money. If you don't get money, you're not going to get food. And if you don't get food, you're going to die. Do you want to die, little Timmy? Is that what you want, little Timmy? Do you want to die? Oh, you want to live? Okay, well then read the book and do well on the test. And so it doesn't have to say all of that, but the kid, we sort of learn it. Like when you see your parents give money at the store, you kind of like just by osmosis, you learn. That's the way this system works. Our lives are held hostage, and a gun is to our head. And it says, do this, or you're going to die, in effect. And I have to imagine that there's a moment when a teacher looks at a kid and had a good rapport with the kid, and then suddenly the kid failed. And the teacher gives him the F and hands him the paper. And then the kid like walks away and he's like crying. And then afterwards the teacher's sort of like, hey, little Timmy, have a great weekend. And little Timmy's sort of like she was. And the teacher's sort of like, I don't understand. Why do I suddenly have a bad relationship with this kid? All I did was fail him. You know, what's wrong with our relationship? And then they realize, oh my God, had this moment. I think it has to happen for every teacher where they're like, oh my God, I scare children for a living. That's what I do. I tell them, you won't have your future unless you do what I'm telling you to do. If you want your future, you have to do this. I use fear to motivate them. That's what I do. I scare kids. And so what happens here is Sully has like this moral crisis. And I think every teacher at that moment would have this kind of moral crisis. Like, wow, that's what I do. I scare people. I scare children. Children lie awake at night crying because of a monster, and I'm it. Like, what are those monsters in the closet? They're projections of the fact that kids are scared. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of the fact that their teachers could take their futures away. And so there are monsters in closets, except there are hallucinations. I mean, obviously there's not physical monsters, but the hallucination is a projection of the fears that the child has. So Sully's like, this is bad. I'll wrap it up. This is like, how much time do I have?
You've got till 12:30, including Q&A.
Okay, well, I want to have at least a half hour for Q&A. So what time is it?
It's 11:41.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay. So can you maybe like warn me when we have 10?
Yeah.
Maybe just go like,
Yep.
and then 5, because there's a lot there that I really want to. I just want to like pack as much in as I can, so that when we have our discussions, like we've all had a common background of like various theoretical ideas. So what happens? So he has this moral crisis. I mean, I also think, by the way, employers have a moment like that. Actually, I have a student who went back to school, even though he's like, he had this company and he had all this big picnic. And when we talked about it in class, he told me about a moment that he had where all the family members came out for the picnic. And they were all on his staff, you know? I mean, he was like doing pretty well, and he had maybe like 25 families' futures were dependent on his approving of the job that the employee was doing. And he said he had the picnic, and he looked out at the picnic at one point, and he always has this moment where he feels really proud of the lives that he's made possible as an employer. And he would look out and he would just see, wow, look at all those families, the kids with their nice clothes and their shoes and their bicycles, and the dads playing with the kids, and look at these beautiful families. And I've made this possible through my business. I feel so good about that. He's really, he's a good guy. And then he just had this moment where he realized, wow, although it was a long time ago, and at the time it was always the fathers of the family that worked there, and he said, I realized all those fathers come to work every day, often not wanting to, but the way I get them to work there is I say, you like this beautiful family? You like this house you have? You like this life you have? You don't come to work, I'll take it away. I'll take it away from you, that's what I'll do. And he realized, I think also there's that moment where he realized, that's what I do. Okay, so there's the moral crisis moment. I imagine cops have a moment like that, too. I mean, you're standing on the side of the road, and you're getting people to obey the speed limit, and you realize at a certain point, like, wow, this is, or not just that, any kind of situation where cops are punishing people, sure, they have a moment where they realize, like, wow, what I do is I scare people. Teachers scare people to get them to learn. Bosses scare people to get them to work. And the government and the idea of various religions scare people to get them to be moral. Always with the assumption that if you don't scare the kids, they won't learn. If you don't scare the workers, they won't work. And if you don't scare the people, they won't be moral. It's always the assumption. Which means that on one level, you could say the students are afraid of the teachers, and the employees are afraid of the employers, and the citizens are afraid of the government, and the believers are afraid of God. But you could also see that the teachers are afraid of the students, because the teachers are thinking, if these students were left to their own devices, if I didn't scare them, they wouldn't learn anything. I mean, if I say to a teacher, like, isn't it kind of weird? Why don't we stop grading? They say, like, oh, if you don't grade kids, if you don't threaten them with a bad grade, they're not going to learn. You need fear to run the system. And then if you say to an employer, if you say to somebody, like, just talking about economics, like, what if we stopped paying people? I'm interested in this organization called this movement of guaranteed basic income. and I gave the Monsters, Inc. talk actually this summer at their conference in New York. Basic Income Network, the concept is just, let's just give everybody like $30,000 a year. The government just gives it to everybody. You're a citizen, you got it. You want to spend the entire time like smoking pot in your mom's basement playing video games? Do it, $30,000. You want to work really hard? Great, $30,000 in addition to whatever your salary is. And the response is always like, where did your mind go when I just presented that idea? What's the first thing that you thought of? Yeah.
Well, it relieves so much stress, and it makes everything possible because you could manifest what's inside you.
Okay, well, who's like concerned about it? Raise your hand if you saw like, uh-oh, bad idea. Okay, and what's the concern?
Well, the concern is where are we going to get the money, but I'd rather than give health care.
Okay, all right, but what's the other big concern that people have of what might happen if we did this? Yeah, exactly. If you don't scare people and tell them you're going to die and your family's going to die if you don't come to work, they won't work. We need, huh?
Not true. Everyone has their own, that's generalization. I don't mean to be a jerk. But everyone has their own desires, their goals are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. That's my point. I totally agree. There's sort of like we're afraid that without fear, students won't learn. Without fear, people won't work. And without hell, people won't be moral.
It's generalization.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. What I'm saying is that that's the dominant myth in our civilization. The dominant myth in our civilization goes something like this. Society needs people to do, this is a myth. This is the thing that I don't agree with. This is the thing I don't agree with. The dominant myth is that without fear, that we need people to do three basic things. We need them to learn, we need them to work, and we need them to be moral. If people aren't learning, then they're not going to be educated enough, even no matter what civilization you have. You need people to learn something. If we're going to farm, people need to learn how to farm. If it's hunter-gatherers, people need to know how to hunt and gather. If it's an industrial society, people need to, whatever. You always need people to learn something because they need to know something. And you need people to work, and you need people to, be somewhat decent to each other. You don't have those three things. Then the question is, what do we need in order to get those three things to happen? And the dominant myth of our society, I think all civilizations that I can think of, is to get those three things to happen, you need fear. If you don't scare the kids, they won't learn. You got to scare them. You need fear at work too. You need to scare people to get them to go to work. You need to get people to think like, oh my God, if I don't go to work, my life is going to be ruined. So we use fear there. And with morality, again, you use fear. You got to scare people. Tell them if you're a bad person, you'll go to hell. Tell them if you're a bad person, you'll go to jail. Tell them if you're a bad person, terrible things are going to happen to you. And with that fear, that you need fear in all those situations. So the genius of Monsters, Inc. is that they have this society that literally runs on fear. And at a certain point, so what happens is Sully has his moral crisis, and he confronts Waternoose, and he's sort of like, Mr. Waternoose, this is wrong what we do. We scare kids. And Mr. Waternoose basically responds and says, do you like the fact that we're having this conversation in a clean, well-lit room? Do you like the fact that that the power's working here, that this room is warm? Do you like the fact that the society's working, that there's cars going and everything? Well, 10, great. Well,
Actually, the food won't be here till 1. We're not so much in a time crunch. That
Okay.
gives us about an hour, but just keep in mind at 12:30, some people might need to leave.
I'm good. I'll wrap it up in 10 minutes. And then we can have a discussion. So Mr. Waternoose's response is, look, scaring kids might be immoral, but you need fear to run our civilization. Without fear, the civilization won't work. Do you want the whole society to collapse? So that for me is like the moment when either I have a conversation with somebody else, the person who has that moral crisis is like, wow, I scare people, I'm a monster. Whenever they have a conversation with somebody else or with themselves, the conversation goes exactly like this, the conversation with Sully and Waternoose. A teacher maybe says, wow, I can't believe I scare kids for a living. That's awful. That's so mean. And then the other voice, whether, again, it's in their head or if they present that idea to somebody else, the response is, yeah, but without fear, society won't work. Without scaring the kids, if you don't grade the kids, they're not going to learn anything. And then usually it's sort of like, yeah, I guess that's true. So then you go back and we keep scaring each other because we think without fear, nobody's going to do what we need the society to do. In this movie, though, what happens is Sully doesn't give up. And he realizes that every time Boo laughs, he gets really excited, there's like a power surge. And he realizes that, in fact, not only you can run a society on fear. It's true. It's very efficient. It can work. You can get people to go to work. You can get kids to learn. You can get people to be moral by telling them, scaring them, or threatening them or bribing them. You can do it. It does work. But what Sully realizes is that you can run the society just as well, in fact, better through joy. So at the end of the movie, you see the monsters coming to work, and hey Jim, how's it going? And then they go up to the doors, and they go into the kids' rooms, and you're like, wow, it's just the same thing again. You just realize that, I guess we need fear to run our society. And the monsters go in, and the kid wakes up and looks at the monster, and the monster does like this kind of song and dance and like comedy act. And the kid laughs and screams and has so much fun, and they bottle that. And it turns out they can run their society not only just as well, but much better with joy and laughter as they can from fear and intimidation. And so that for me is like this really powerful movie. I mean, I would say watch this movie with your kids and then talk about it afterwards. I remember when I left the movie, there was a dad and a daughter, and I swear, like, the dad kind of looked like Sully, and the daughter kind of looked like Boo, and she was like holding her finger, and she said to her dad, "Daddy, is it Too?" And the father's like, "What, little bear?" And the little bear says, "Is it true that the way they get all the cars to go and the lights to go on and all the electricity, they get that by scaring children?" And the dad's like, no, little girl. Fear is just an emotion. You can't run a society on fear. We run our society on coal and natural gas. And, and I remember I was thinking, like, that kid got that movie. That kid got that movie. I don't feel like the parent did so much. So for me, it's like incredibly optimistic. And when I teach it in my classes, I say to them, like, so do we live in a society of fear? They agree most of what they're doing in a given day, they're doing because they're scared of what will happen to them otherwise. And then the next question is like, well, could we have a society that's not run on fear? And then I'll ask them, like, is a fear-based society, and these are questions we can discuss if you want, is a fear-based society truly a free society? And do we live in a fear-based society? And is a non-fear-based society possible? I feel like that's the challenge of the movie, that we're all thinking like, oh, we need to have all these threats of punishment to get our society to work. But I feel like what's really interesting about your organization is that you are challenging, of those three things that society needs us to do, they need us to learn, to work, and to be moral. The mission of your organization is to challenge the third column. Say, like, no, actually, without fear of hell, people can still be moral. What I'm inviting you to do is consider that project within a larger context of what I consider life without fear. That we could have schools where the kids don't learn because they're afraid of what will happen to them otherwise. And we could have workplaces where somebody comes to work, like baking bread, because she wants people to have awesome bread. That's why she does it. And students go to school and they learn because they're really interested in how the moon rotates around the earth. And people are moral because they really care about each other. I think that would be a truly free society. But the first obstacle to that society is that we're afraid that people can't do it. The monsters are afraid of the humans. And the other genius of Monsters, Inc. is that in the end, the government, there's like this sort of like scene when the FBI is taking these people away, and you realize that they were convincing everybody that the humans were scary, but they knew the humans weren't scary all along. I think we sort of convinced ourselves that people are scary, and if left to their own devices without fear and intimidation, they would be terrible, and society would collapse, that we need fear. And the beauty of Monsters, Inc. to me is that it presents in a really fun way all the complex nuances, many of the complex nuances of this entire conversation, and challenges us to consider the possibility that we could run our society just as well, if not better, if it was rooted in joy and fun and innate free desires as we can if it's run on the dread and threat of coercion and fear. Thanks.
As usual, we're going to use the other microphone for Q&A so we can capture everything on the video. Is there anybody who'd like to start our discussion? I'm going to start over here, and then I'll get to you, Ed.
I'm sorry we were late, but who is responsible for that movie? The writing, the creation?
What's the name of the writer?
Yeah.
I should totally know that, shouldn't I? Like, who would stand up and talk about a novel without knowing right off the bat who the writer is? I'm sorry, I don't know.
Wow. Was it collaborative? Or?
But now I know that I don't know that. Thanks for pointing that out to me.
I'd like
I'm
to
sure
make
we can
another-
figure it out. Yeah,
I'd
but
like
I
to
would
make
be
another
interested,
point.
yeah. I mean, one of the weird things about analyzing movies like this is, I mean, you do kind of have to ask yourself, do you really think they were thinking all of that? But I kind of think they were. And we haven't even talked about the prequel, which is explicitly called Monsters University, which is explicitly about school. Explicitly the dynamics between teachers and students. So I think he was really thinking about it, but certainly if I'm going to keep thinking about this, I should learn something about who wrote it and what was going on in their mind. Yeah.
I'd like to make another point. I think the leaning towards joy is good. You know, Beethoven, Freude. But
Oh, I got it. Yeah.
but there's something else that drives people to do something as well as they possibly can, and that's sort of a tough process in itself. I mean, my wife and I were musicians, and we aspired to be able to play as well as we possibly could. But in order to do that, you get punished if you don't, and you respect that punishment. And I was also an athlete, and I didn't see it at the time, but towards the end of my career, I started to lose, and then I said, "Whoa," But those things are still part of striving that is a positive force in society, I think.
Sure. I guess I would just say, I'll just say really quickly, it is. I'm a musician also, and I remember my dad making me sit for a half hour every day and practice. And if I didn't practice, then, I would get in trouble and privileges taken away. And it was really powerful, and I learned my scales and everything. I guess my question, it's very powerful. I guess my question is, could it be possible for us to do all of those things without it? Could it be possible? And the challenge of Monsters, Inc. is it says, yes, the only difference is that you would actually do it much better. But I do agree that our basic assumption is that we need that fear because without it, we wouldn't accomplish what we could accomplish otherwise. I feel like Monsters, Inc. just says, maybe not.
If Ed will forgive me, I'm going to alternate genders, I think, as I go through. And Annette, you had your hand up earlier, didn't you? I'll start with you.
Yeah. I started running an Awakening Joy women's workshop. And what people are finding is that when they have the possibility of letting go, and they have the tools for doing that, letting go of fear, angst, and all of that, that what fills in is actually joy. Joy, contentment, delight. And so it's been a wonderful process to watch people who have been stuck in, everybody's stuck in some area of their lives. They've been so stuck, can't get something to change within themselves, or perhaps in a relationship. And suddenly, when they have new tools and fear doesn't have to be running the show, when contentment or delight are become present, that suddenly, like, oh my God, I could change that easily.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to go to Ed and then Donna Marie, and then I'll come back to her. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, let's start with that.
Just start with that.
Go ahead, Martha.
Okay. The movie was written by a team, but the first person is Peter Docter, and he also wrote Up and Inside Out, which have very similar themes.
Hey. Well, I enjoyed your talk. I'll take a different tack, as I often do. I'm one of the oldest people in this room, and I've traveled around quite a bit, and I never believed more in monsters than I do today. And I've never seen a level of fear greater than I have today. And the fear permeates so much of a society, from the streets of Manhattan to little towns in the middle of Pennsylvania. People are scared, and I think there's monsters in each of us, and the monsters can be generated by the media, outside sources, the government, and the older I get, the more I realize that there are each of us has the potential to have a monster in us. We forget that in the 1930s, the most educated and technologically sophisticated society in Europe put a monster in office. And we have potential in this country with our tremendous technology to allow the same to occur. And what I see doesn't give me too much cause for optimism. I'd like to see better, but how to make people happy and make them joyful, I don't know. I find it difficult myself, so if you can give me some insights, I would appreciate that. But what I see doesn't please me. I see people who are otherwise wonderful people in little towns all over. When you talk to them, there's a deep hatred in their heart about different things. And people want to have their guns. They want to have their religion, which can be used for terrible things. Not necessarily, but can be. And I just feel sort of at a loss. If you would respond, I'd appreciate that.
Sorry?
I sort of have a response to that.
Oh, okay, maybe we should hear her response, and then I can try to weigh in.
Evolution, psychology, where do we all come from? If we have evolved from beings who had to be very fearful about how they were going to get their next meal or being eaten, right, because of monsters who were tigers, lions, other, animals, whatever. Fear is part of the reptilian brain, the amygdala. It's still running. It's still running. It's still part of the brain. And it still kind of takes over. And that's where we store our emotions. And we make copies of it in the brain. So it's like a railroad track that goes along the same route all the time. And it gets fed by civilization, by different cultures. But knowing the brain, knowing the mind, getting to understand the psychology of how we got there and how it works, and it's sort of like now we have the cerebral cortex that's trying to rationalize and reason everything for us. We're not using it. We're not understanding how to think creatively. We're not understanding a lot of things about how the brain itself functions. So I think basically, to me, everybody in this whole world needs to understand how the brain's been operating. And it's been operating at this primal level of fear, because that is instinct and that is what we've known. But there are techniques of meditation to understand the brain, how it works, and when we're tapping into those areas that are fear, and when other people are using those areas to trigger our fears. So it's all a matter of education and understanding how we are put together and believing that we can evolve. Can we evolve? You know, how many of us believe that we can evolve mentally so that we can go on?
Thanks. I guess all I could maybe add is, you know, there's this psychologist who's actually still is retired from the University of Syracuse named Edward Deci. He wrote a book recently called Why We Do What We Do. And what's really amazing about the work that he did is in the 1960s, the way psychologists talk about these, would codify what I'm talking about is extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Jimmy and Billy are reading the same book. Jimmy's reading it because he can't wait to see what happens next. He's intrinsically motivated. Billy's reading the book. He doesn't care about it at all, but there's a test on Friday. So he's going to get through it just as well, but he's extrinsically motivated. Somebody has taken the book, reading the book, and something that's not intrinsically connected with reading the book, namely getting good grades or getting a good job or something, and connected those two things. The first kid's reading the book because he's going to the next page because it's connected to his desires. What Edward Deci suspected was he had this hypothesis that he called that there might be something called the over-justification effect. And the way the over-justification effect works is, the basic theory is that extrinsic motivation actually tends to erode intrinsic motivation. So the idea was always like, look, if the first kid's intrinsically motivated to read a book, then say to the kid, hey kid, read this book. And if you do really well in your reading, I'll give you a pizza, or I'll give you a good grade, or I'll give you some sort of sticker. I'll give you some sort of like dopamine rush pat on the back. Good job, you read the book. And the idea is like, well, that reward will just be a little extra, a little bonus. Like, whoa, I get to read the book that I wanted to read anyway, and I get a pat on the back. That's awesome. And the other kid, he didn't want to read it in the first place, so he lacked intrinsic motivation. So let's just supplement that lack of intrinsic motivation with some extrinsic motivation. Okay, you don't want to read the book? Well, read it, or else I'll take your future away. Okay, good, now you're reading. But the over-justification effect says that actually that kid, that first kid, who, first of all, you're not going to get the second kid to be interested in it that way. In fact, but the first kid, if he had intrinsic motivation and then you added extrinsic motivation, you actually tend to take away his initial intrinsic motivation. He keeps doing it, but he's no longer doing it because he wants to do it. He's doing it because he has to do it. So what if it's the case that the extrinsic motivation programs that we have to get people to learn, work, and be moral is actually eroding any intrinsic motivation we might have had to learn, work, or be moral. Any innate curiosity is beaten out of kids because learn or you're in trouble. Extrinsic motivation took away their intrinsic motivation. All the sort of internal drive we might have to work and do something productive with our lives is beaten out of us because somebody says work or else you're in trouble. And any sort of innate capacity for love, compassion, and care for each other's well-being, or even, more abstract, cold, emotionless respect for each other's rights or something like that, all the sort of intrinsic foundations, free foundations for morality, is actually get eroded when you introduce fear into the picture. You go up to a kid, and if you have little kids, you might have experienced that they actually like helping out around the house at a certain age. And then later on, they don't like helping around the house. What happened in between? Well, one thing that happened is that we started to say to them, do the work around the house or else. we started to, and do the work on the house, and I'll give you a bonus. We started to use extrinsic motivation with them. Well, if the overjustification effect is right, and they've done countless studies in all these different contexts, they keep doing it. They keep studying it. And the reason why psychologists keep studying doing more tests to prove the overjustification effect, I mean, they can't find a context now where it doesn't work. They take two groups of people, they motivate one extrinsically, the other one, they both already had intrinsic motivation. One group gets motivated extrinsically, the other one doesn't. The one who is motivated extrinsically, they check back with them a year later and they've lost their motivation. Not all of the time, but like a large, statistically significant amount of the time. Well, what would be the policy recommendation if that was true? If extrinsic motivation erodes intrinsic motivation, that would mean that our schools are making us less curious, our workplaces are making us less want to work, and our reward and punishment systems, whether it's the parents that say, share your toys or you're in trouble, little Jimmy, or the state which says, don't steal or we'll send you to jail, or religions saying, don't steal or we'll send you to hell. What if all of those things are actually actively eroding our intrinsic motivation? And so it's a feedback loop. Then all the kids become uninspired to learn, and workers become lazy and not wanting to work, and people become less intrinsically interested in being moral to each other. And so the response is like, oh my God, look how scary those people are. And so we double down on our extrinsic motivation, which depletes our intrinsic motivation even more, which leads to a tripling down on extrinsic motivation. Now kids don't care about grades. First, they care about learning. You introduce grades. Now they don't care about learning, they care about grades. Then after a while, kids are stopping to care about grades. So parents say, oh, well, you care about money. So I'll give you money to get good grades. And then they're not interested in money anymore, whatever. I'll just live in the basement. And it's like, well, what now can I threaten them with? They've lost, and that becomes proof. Like, you see, if you don't threaten people, they'll just sit around in their parents' basement. But what if the reason why they're doing that is because of years of their intrinsic motivation getting beaten out of them by extrinsic motivation? Okay.
I saw Ron's hand earlier, so I'm going to go to him next. And then Barb after you.
In the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation, they've reached a point where everybody's physical needs are met. People are no longer in fear, unless somebody else trying to take it from them. Basically, they're not in fear they have all their physical needs met. And the same thing happened 30 years earlier in the TV show Bewitched, though that source was different, that was magic. But it makes you think about what your world would be like if you had no reason to fear hunger, lack of shelter, all those physical needs not being met. I guess that was just a comment, or you can respond to that if you wish. My other point is this. 5 years ago is when I guess I first discerned that fear is such a very, very strong motivating factor for people and their societies built around it. And I started to wonder what the opposite or antidote of fear is. Came up with hope as the antidote. Spoiler.
Please.
Okay, I mean, well, I would just, in response to the second thing that you said, I kind of think back to, I'm sorry, I don't know. Annette, what Annette said is like, yeah, what would happen if fear went away? What would take its place? In my classes, so I don't raise my kids with rewards and punishments. The conditional, if you do this, then this will happen, doesn't exist in our lexicon at home. And as a teacher, I know this is like sort of like kind of something I don't want my dean to really know that well, but I don't actually grade my students anymore. I have them grade themselves. And, you know, immediately the thought is like, oh no, dude, don't do it. It's a terrible idea. They just won't learn anything and just give themselves A's. So it's sort of like an experiment. I think in a way the answer to the question is, we don't know. You know, if we took fear away, what would happen? What would rush in its place? The assumption is that all masses of evil would rush into its place. If you don't, when I tell other parents, or my dean really fully understood, so she has a sense that at the college I'm letting students grade themselves, the response is like, that's crazy. If you don't tell a student, learn or I'll give you a bad grade, if you've taken away that leverage, without extrinsic motivation, there'll be no other motivation.
How many A's
They give themselves a fair amount of A's. And for the first time in my teaching career, they actually deserve it. I mean, I've had students write, amazing papers on Descartes, where they have like all their sources and they've synthesized a great amount of literature, and they totally deserve an A on that paper by all academic standards, and it meant nothing to them and it didn't change anything in their lives. And in 6 months, if their brains are working correctly, they will have forgotten it. I mean, the studies are beyond conclusive that students get hundreds on tests and then within a month they've started to deteriorate that. The brain is a filtering organ. What it does is it has to choose what to retain, and it retains things that are important. And if the reason why the brain thinks that the information is important is because there's a test on Wednesday, if the brain is functioning properly, on Thursday it will begin to forget it. They give students a test a year after they've gotten 100 on it, and they get like a 30 on it. 6 months, they're getting like a 50 on it. The deterioration is very rapid because they have very healthy brains. But so for me, my students are giving themselves A's by and large, and they're writing papers that they will be able to go back to. They're not going to forget what they wrote in those papers, and they'll be able to go back to them in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and actually be able to peer into what was going on inside of their hearts and souls because they wrote something that was actually meaningful for them. Whereas before that, and I think for most of my colleagues, the papers those students are writing, yeah, they're getting A's, and by normal academic standards, they're very good. They did what the teacher wanted them to do. But the idea that they'll be able to look back at what they wrote when they were 18 and find something that's actually meaningful in their process of figuring out who they are, I don't think it's going to happen, and they're going to forget it. So, and I don't take attendance, and attendance is higher than it's ever been. When I tell students like 4 classes and you're out, typically by the end of the semester they'll have missed 4 classes. Now they tend to not miss any classes. And I don't think it's because I'm such an awesome teacher. I think it's because, wow, like somebody's not pressuring me in that way, and I can actually come to class because I want to come to class. So I don't know what would be in its place, but I just decided I'm not going to be afraid of it. I'm not going to fear my students. I'm not going to fear my kids. I'm not afraid of what they'll do.
This is a pretty amazing subject, and thank you. I mean, we could spend hours, throwing this stuff around. But my mom was involved in what do you call it? Special education kids, behavioral problems. And I remember at the time I was just beginning college and such, and she used to talk to me all the time about the stuff that she was studying because she was she went back to school at that time herself. And the big thing at that time, now we're talking 40, 45 years ago, positive reinforcement. And they were just going on and on and on about how positive reinforcement was so much better than negative. I don't understand why 45 years later we're still having discussions about whether or not negative reinforcement is viable. But my question to you is, do you think that positive reinforcement could also be counterproductive, as too much of a reward, too much of a here's your cookie system?
Totally. Yeah, one of the really interesting things about Edward Deci work is that what's really revolutionary about it is that, and he's still around, by the way, I emailed him a little while ago. What's really revolutionary about it is that it's saying exactly that. Look, if there's 3 kids, if it's like kid A, B, and C, kid A is reading the book because he loves it. Kid B is reading the book because he's scared. If he fails this test, his financial aid is going to be taken away. Kid C is reading the book because if he reads one more book this summer, he gets a free pizza at Pizza Hut. The big discussion at that time period was the difference between B and C, right? And B and C are very different. One kid's reading the book because he's scared. It's a threat. The other kid's reading the book because of a bribe. That's very different. Negative, positive reinforcement, great. But they're actually the same when you compare them to kid A. That difference really goes away. If one kid, if you think about it in terms of morality, person A is helping somebody because he cares about his well-being. Person B is helping somebody because he's afraid of going to hell. Person C is helping the person because he wants to go to heaven. B and C are very different, and churches that emphasize B tend to be very different from churches that emphasize C. I got it. But really, B and C are very similar in the sense that from the perspective of the binary of intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, both B and C are both being extrinsically motivated. And if it's true that extrinsic motivation tends to erode intrinsic motivation, it does just as well with positive reinforcement as negative reinforcement. Those stickers that we get are also eroding intrinsic motivation just as well. I mean, the reward sensors, like in terms of the brain, the dopamine that we get, one of the things that we've learned from the science of addiction is that what you can, and how it relates to the overjustification effect, is what you can do intrinsically, like dopamine production. The way the body works is if you can get it elsewhere easier, then you'll stop producing it. So we stopped gardening because it was easier for us to just go get the food at the supermarket. The brain produces dopamine, and if you get it elsewhere, then your brain will just say, oh, I don't need to produce dopamine anymore. And so one external source of dopamine is various narcotics. Another very powerful source of dopamine is getting reward. That good job, little Jimmy, that kid's brain lights up just like somebody doing a line of coke. And we become dependent on that external influence, and then we start to focus in our lives how I'm perceived by others more than who I am, with all of the consequences of that. Like maybe a president would suddenly become more concerned with how much people like him than what he's doing. That could happen.
Just hypothetically.
I'll go to Keith next, and then I'll come back and get you.
I'm going to go back to the 1940s in the small town I lived in South Jersey. There was a woman, a pair of sisters. They were both 90. They drove an old car, and one of them was blind, and she's the one that had the license. So the other one would tell her where to turn and everything. And they never went over 10 miles an hour, and the community accepted them. If you've seen our town, this is kind of the same situation in real life. The next thing is in Germany with the Autobahns, you drive at whatever speed you feel is appropriate. And as much as they may have tried to take away this unlimited speed on the superhighways there, the Autobahn, the people will not go for it because they think it's intrinsically up to them to enjoy the way they drive, and they have certain standards that they use there to keep things going, and they're very safe roads. They're a lot safer than they are here. The other situation is in the United States, where the recommendation for setting speed limits is that it be at the 85th percentile of what the traffic is running at, or close to that. This is ignored by most states, and they set their own speed limits. So you end up with a speed limit which is 15 or 20 miles below what it should be. And the effect of that is if you're driving down the road and you're happy and all that, you just drive whatever speed you feel is good, and that's fine. Unless, of course, there's a trooper waiting for you to give you a ticket. And after he gives you the ticket, then you slow down to that 15 or 20 miles an hour below the speed limit, and you drive unsafely. Because while you were driving safely at whatever you thought was the right speed, and people will determine their own speed, it becomes unsafe when you're forced to go at a much less speed. So the intrinsic value of that is changed by this extrinsic fines that are levied by the state to do that. And they don't want to change that. They want to make sure they can get all the tickets they want.
I'll go to Robin and then come back. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just really quickly, two things I was going to say really quickly. One is, there's a lot, but one thing is, if it's the case that people's intrinsic, if let's say the overjustification effect is true, that all those studies that have been done, it turns out that it really does make sense. Extrinsic motivation erodes intrinsic motivation. Then there's two questions from a policy perspective, like what we should do when you say in terms of like they don't want to change that. There's two questions. One is, well, what should we do when like they're babies? You know, like if it's the case, according to this theory, this baby has this intrinsic motivation to learn. She's curious to do something meaningful, productive, work in this life, and she's going to have concern for the rest of the planet, for other people, whatever. If we assume that, and that what's going to happen, no stress. What's going to happen, according to the overjustification effect, is that because society is afraid of her, afraid that without fear, she's not actually going to amount to anything. She's not going to learn anything, and she's not going in school, and she's not going to work, and she's not going to be moral. So they're going to use extrinsic motivation because they're afraid of her and of what would happen otherwise, and that's going to erode her intrinsic motivation. There's two questions. What should we do right off the bat? And I think maybe the answer to there would be, well, let's not use extrinsic motivation. You know. So for me, when I learned about this theory, and by the way, Alfie Kohn is really the person who's done the most research. Kohn. He's a really interesting thinker if you want to think about this more. He wrote this amazing book called Punished by Rewards that was exactly dealing with how it is that the rewards programs in schools are eroding kids' intrinsic motivation to learn. But anyway, if that's what's happening, if this intrinsic motivation is being eroded, then first thing with policy was like, well, let's not reward and punish our kids. Let's not bribe them to do their chores with money. Let's not bribe them to do their homework with grades. Let's not bribe them to be good people by saying, well, they'll be punished if they're not good people. Okay, that's fine. Maybe that's a good idea. But what about the people who have spent the last, most of our lives having our intrinsic motivation be eroded? Now we actually do have a situation where people's intrinsic motivation has been taken away. And if now you try your experiment where you take away the fear, now you really do have something to fear. So for example, 6-year-olds, don't start rewarding and punishing them to learn. I really believe that. I homeschooled my kids primarily for this reason. They've never been extrinsically motivated in any way to learn. And, not to pat myself on the back, but I think they're really smart. And they read what they're interested in reading, and they learn what they're interested in learning. And I never say to them, learn this or else at all. And their intrinsic motivation to learn has not been eroded. But the state makes them pass a test every few years, and it's no problem. But then I have these 18-year-olds, right? So it was always weird for me. I spend the morning with these intrinsically curious kids, and then toddlers are a nightmare because they're so freaking curious. So they're just like, oh, what happens if I knock this over? What happens if I kick the cat? And it's like, oh my God, toddlers are so intense. They're so curious. It's a nightmare. And then I'm dealing with these 18-year-olds, and I walk in the room, and the kids are just sort of like these toddlers. I'm seeing them now 12 years later after going through 12 years of schooling. And they walk in, and they're just like, oh, God, kill me. Just tell me what I have to read. Is it going to be on the test? 12 years. What happened? What if it's because extrinsic motivation erodes intrinsic motivation? But after 18 years, if I walk in on the first day and I say, I'm not going to use fear, you guys. If you don't want to come to class, don't come to class. Because I tried this. If you don't want to learn anything, don't learn anything. If you don't want to read, don't read. Only do these things because you're intrinsically motivated to do it. I'm not taking attendance. If you're not interested in this class and don't want to come back, just don't come back and give yourself an A. Well, now it doesn't work. Had you tried that when they were 6, I think they would have been like, awesome, what are we learning? You tell them that at 18, after the 12 years of their intrinsic motivation being eroded by grades, and now they're just like, wait, I don't have to come to class? Well, I'm not intrinsically motivated to do anything here because for the past 12 years, my intrinsic motivation has been eroded, except they won't think that. They'll think, I'm not interested in learning anything here, so I'm not going to come. I'm just going to give myself an A. I started getting students say to me, like, yo, are you that professor who, like, I can just not even go and get an A? I heard I can just, this class I can sign, because I live in New Jersey, it's a really far commute. I can just sign up and get my 3 credits and not actually do anything. I heard I can draw a stick figure and give myself an A, which is a joke I say every time, and I've never had a student take me up on it. He's like, can I just do that? And so I was like, oh, okay. You can't just lead with that. You have to do some deep programming. I'd say, like, I'll tell you guys, talk to me about, like, what were you interested in doing? Has it ever happened in your life that you were interested in doing something, and then there was a reward and punishment program, and you stopped being interested in doing it? That thing you were interested in doing, that's who you are. And if you don't find what that is, I don't care how much money you're going to get, which is also just a reward, you're never going to be happy, because you're never going to be doing what you want. And what you want, I don't believe that extrinsic motivation destroys intrinsic motivation. I believe that extrinsic motivation hides intrinsic motivation. And what I promise them is that if we do this work together, we'll be able to uncover what's actually beneath there, what it is that would flood in if you took the fear away. But in order to do that, I have to take the fear away. If I stand up there and I say to them, like, okay, now write a paper on fear, and if you don't write it, I'm going to give you a bad grade and take away your future. I have to give them that freedom. And when I give them that freedom, what fills in the void is amazing. It turns out the humans aren't scary. That's what I think.
All right. Thank you.